Okay, welcome. Welcome back to all of you who came last 2 weeks, and welcome to the new people. We're going to start off this session with a meditation, but it's going to be a little shorter than we were doing before. We're only going to do 5 minutes this time. And I'm not going to guide you because I'm assuming you've done some calm abiding meditation already, so you know how to calm yourself. I do want to remind you to set a positive motivation, a positive intention for doing this activity, like we always do when we start any activity. We start a positive motivation that it be of benefit for both ourselves and others. So let's go ahead and start meditating, and then I'll ring the bell, and then we'll talk some more. Okay, coming out of the meditation, just a couple of things before we start. For those of you who haven't been here before, the way we will do this is we'll start off each class with this short calm abiding, settling the mind meditation, and then I'll teach for about 45 minutes. Then after that, we'll have time for some question and answer. And so I have an assistant there that is Felipe. He's under registered Tushita, and he's my technical assistant. And so anything that you chat goes to him and not to me, because I'm not looking at the chat. It would be too distracting for me and I would get all mixed up. So when we get to the question and answer, he will ask you to type in your questions, and then he will unmute you. And it's good if you can turn on your video then, and I can see you and we can talk, and it's more interesting for everybody if we can have a dialogue. If you're having difficulty with the audio, if you can't hear me or my voice is distorted because of the connection, then sometimes it helps if you stop your video. You'll still be able to see me, I just won't be able to see you. So sometimes that's helpful, so you can hear me more clearly. After the question and answer session, then Felipe will lead meditation, guided meditation on the topic that we were talking about. So I'm very happy that you all are here. I think it's amazing. We're up to 180 people. It's awesome. And this morning we had over 102. So I'm very happy for this, that all of you are creating the space and the energy to do this class. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to say before we start? So this course is called Going Deeper because it's a continuation of the last course, and it is, so we'll review slightly what we did in the last course, but mostly we're going to expand on those topics and go deeper into those topics that we talked about in the last course. So it will be much more similar to, and if you ever attended a Tushita Introduction to Buddhism course, it will be more like that, and also go a little bit into what an intermediate course would present. So I hope that you enjoy it and that you benefit from it. So I want to talk today about some of the history after the Buddha passed away. So some of the spread of Buddhism in the last basically 2,600 years. So the Buddha lived until he was 80. And he had many followers. He had people who were wandering around, mostly the Ganges River Valley, they would come and receive teachings from him. Maybe they would spend the rainy season, the monsoon, with him, and then they would go off and wander around, in particular because at the time the villages were the ones who supported them, who fed them, and took care of them, medicine and that sort of thing. And it was a very noble lifestyle to be one of these wandering holy people. But it was also very dangerous, of course. And the original followers of the Buddha, that's where we get this idea of going forth, or what ordination is. To become a follower, a disciple of the Buddha was the original monastics, and everyone, well, not all of the Buddha's disciples at that time were only the ones who were following him, who were the monastics. There were also people in the community who continued to have, homes and families, and they were what are called lay people. So for the Buddha, it was very important that there be both lay people and monastics as part of the community of Buddhist followers. It was just the only path was not just being a monastic and doing this going forth, sort of this householder, they let's see, leaving the householder life, they called it. And another aspect is that also in the time of the Buddha ordained women. So the first woman who was ordained by the Buddha was actually his aunt, who raised him. So his mother passed away when he was, I believe, in childbirth or shortly thereafter, and it was his aunt who raised him. And his aunt came to him, and she wanted to be one of his disciples who had, had this wandering lifestyle. This, being a holy person and begging and giving up family and possessions and that sort of thing. And but the problem is that it was very dangerous for women. And so at first, and there was also, the Buddha was really challenging social conventions at the time. There was the emergence of the caste system that was happening in India at the time. And for the Buddha, caste didn't matter. Any caste or no caste at all were welcome into his, as his followers. And so that was kind of challenging the established convention of the time. So to then also take women on and give women this opportunity to practice in his system was also, because of course 2,600 years ago, patriarchy, the patriarchy was very strong. I can't even remember the right word. Patriarchal. Thank you. The patriarchal system was very strong, and so women, of course, didn't have a lot of power, even less than they do now. And so at first he was hesitant, and he wasn't going to ordain women. But then his cousin and his attendant Ananda spoke up for women, and one of the things that he said was, don't women also have the ability to become enlightened in a woman's body? And the Buddha said, yes, it doesn't matter what your gender is, that it's about your mind, and mind doesn't have gender. Mind can be either gender. So it can have characteristics of either gender. So then he did decide to allow women to become ordained, but he gave them more vows, and it's not because women are somehow inferior in any way. It was more because of protection, and in society, in protecting women. So that's why you will hear that nuns have more vows than monks. And it was actually because of the necessity of protecting his followers in a society where there was more danger for women. So anyway, women ordained, women became his followers. They had nuns and monks both, and princesses were his followers. It didn't really matter. Anyone could be their followers. He had kings that were followers. In general, the kings were very supportive of him when they were Buddhist kings. Providing a space, they would give him space to do his retreats and support him in many ways. So after the Buddha passed away, Ananda, also his attendant, was known for having this very powerful memory. So he also was able to remember all the teachings of the Buddha. So the way that the teachings were originally passed down after the Buddha passed away were in this verbal form. So from teacher to student to teacher to student. So this warm hand to warm hand. So the presence of a lineage becomes very important, that one can trace back their teachings to the source, to the Buddha himself. And so there wasn't a lot of paper around at that time to write down the teachings. And the memories of these beings who were learning the teachings and memorizing the teachings were very powerful. They had very powerful memories. So their ability to carry these teachings was and do it in an accurate way was very powerful. The other aspect is that when we talk about the Dharma and we talk about the teachings of the Buddha, we're not just talking about the texts, like you see all these books behind me. Those are in Tibetan, those are the words of the Buddha. But there are also the realizations or the insights or the understandings that occurred in the followers' minds. So it wasn't that that one could read and memorize the teachings, wasn't necessarily helpful in terms of, you know, changing your life, but it was the fact that they developed these insights, and they trained their minds, and they changed their mental habits, and they, you know, started to see the world from the point of view in which the Buddha had taught, you know, these concepts of selflessness and impermanence and emptiness and, you know, bodhicitta, you know, all these different concepts. So the Dharma becomes also the realizations in the minds of all the followers. And that's what's actually passed down. So it may come in the form of teachings and in words, but in actuality, it's the insights that are developed, that are passed down. And those insights can be tested, whether they, you know, whether the words are correct or not, or whether they came actually from the Buddha, cannot necessarily be tested. But whether they do the job that they're supposed to do, whether they actually remove the suffering and decrease the negative emotions in the minds of the followers. This is the true test of whether Buddhism has been communicated and taught and passed on and you know, promulgated in new cultures. Is, you know, are people's minds actually changing? So let's see. So let's see, right after the Buddha passed, they had a council, they had Ananda repeat all the teachings. They again disseminated the teachings all over India, and Buddhism spread. So it was powerful. It was very widespread in India until about the 11th century. So it had a long run from about 6th century BCE to 11th century CE. Buddhism was extant in India, and it was around the 11th century that it was destroyed pretty much in India, and wiped out in India, and other systems, other religion systems became more popular. But before that happened, we have this spread of Buddhism to other parts of the world. So it spread to the south, to Sri Lanka. It spread over to where it still exists now, in Thailand and Burma, Myanmar, in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, that whole area, Southeastern Asia, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia. And those teachings that spread south were actually written down. They were written down between 300 and 500 years after the Buddha passed away. And they were written first down in a dialect of the language that the Buddha actually spoke. So the language is Pali, P-A-L-I. So Pali is, the Buddha spoke a dialect of Pali, and those were the first language that the Buddha's words were written down in. And that it's called the Pali Canon now, and it is considered the foundational teachings, or the basic teachings, or the, you know, the most public teachings that the Buddha taught. And it is still, you know, it's been translated into English. It is still extant. Now the teachings also moved north. So they first moved north, like into what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan. They moved up the Silk Road into China, and eventually Korea and Japan. And of course, they moved into Tibet. Now, the language that these teachings were written down was the Sanskrit language. So the Sanskrit language was actually considered a more refined or more intellectual language, because it was the language of the Vedas, which were the holy books of the um, the main religion. There are lots and lots of Hinduism is actually a bunch of different religions that they clump together and call Hinduism, but the main religion that is based on these holy books, the Vedas, were actually written down in Sanskrit. And so they wrote the Buddhist doctrine down in Sanskrit. So these teachings that spread north. So when the Buddha was alive, he taught some teachings very publicly, okay, to many different people. And when he taught, he would teach particularly to the level that his followers needed to hear. So depending on where the people that he was teaching to, what level they were at, he would teach to them. So sometimes they say that there are contradictory teachings within Buddhism, because when he taught, they call the first turning of the wheel, he taught this concept of selflessness, which is present in the Pali Canon, but he didn't teach this more extensive concept of emptiness, of the selflessness of phenomena, because that was a little bit too shocking for some people, and they would think, oh, that means nothing exists, so that means karma doesn't affect me, and so then I can do anything. So the way in which the Buddha taught, his teachings were very much they were disjointed in some ways, because they were taught to so many, he would travel around and teach to they weren't very systematic. So then you have the followers in India, and around the, between about the 3rd and the 11th century, you have in India these huge monastic universities that are all based in these Buddhist teachings, and they are all with, thousands, and you can visit one of the ruins of one of these in Nalanda in northern India, not very far from Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And they, they would have like, 10,000 monastics that would all be practicing and studying and debating, and, this monastic code and the Buddha's teachings. And and so they very much systematized the Buddha's teachings. They organized it and elaborated it and tested it, and passed it down in much more formal philosophical ways. So so then when it spreads to Tibet, we get a much more organized kind of system of the Buddha's teachings. Okay, so back to when the Buddha was originally teaching, he would teach some teachings publicly. He would teach some teachings more privately to those who he felt they were more ready for it. And he would teach some even secretly. Okay, so let's take a look at this document that Felipe gave you the link to. It's on the Google Drive, and I'm going to bring it up in my screen share. So if you can, open it for yourself, that's great. If you can't, I tried to make it as big as I could. So this is the document that we're looking at. And I understand it's a lot of reading. It's not as good as a PowerPoint, but it's what we have. So you can see that the vehicle, the first column there, you have the 3 vehicles, okay? So when the Buddhist teachings traveled to Tibet, they were contained in their entirety. So the teachings that traveled to South India and the, like I said, Sri Lanka and South Asia area, we have primarily the Theravada, or the foundation vehicle, that was written down in the Pali Canon. And then those teachings that traveled north, like into China, Afghanistan, Mongolia, Japan, they have the Mahayana vehicle, which became more popular actually in India in around the 1st century BCE. So this concept of bodhicitta and the bodhisattva was actually not taught, and not is not emphasized. It's present, but it isn't emphasized so much in this foundation vehicle. And then the Vajrayana, or the full tantric teachings, the only place in which they were actually preserved up until the modern day is in Tibet. We have some tantra in China, and we have some tantra in Japan, but we don't have the full tantric system that the Buddha taught much more secretly when he was alive. And it was only in the 1st century CE that the tantric teachings became more popular, even in India, and became more widely spread and more institutionalized within a monastic system. And so the whole of the 3 vehicles were actually preserved in Tibet at the time of, in 1959, when the Chinese invaded and attempted to stamp out all of Buddhism. So the system that we have today here that I'm teaching from is the only complete system that includes all 3 vehicles. Now, it's called a vehicle because it's a way to get somewhere, right? If you want to get to you know, the next town over, or you want to get to New Delhi from Dharamsala, you have to have a vehicle. You have to have a bus, or you have to have a train, or something like this. So a vehicle is a way to get somewhere. So the Theravada vehicle, so Theravada is the name of one of the early schools of the spread of this Pali tradition. And you may have heard the term Hinayana, but Hinayana has kind of a negative meaning of somehow lower or less than the Mahayana vehicle. Mahayana means great vehicle. But they use Theravada because it is less negative in this connotation. But the fact is that you need this foundation vehicle. We need all the aspirations and the goals and the practices and the wisdom of this foundation vehicle. So so you see that then the Mahayana vehicle that became more popular emphasized this idea of bodhicitta and the bodhisattva. So the bodhisattva is someone who has bodhicitta. And then the Vajrayana, or the tantric vehicle, has the same view of bodhicitta, but it also, and it has the same goal of enlightenment, but it has a different way to get there. It has different practices, more related to the generation stage and the completion stage, which we'll talk about more when we get to Tantra towards the end of this course. So let's see. So let's look at, in particular, the difference between nirvana and enlightenment. So you see that the goal for the Theravada tradition is nirvana, and someone who achieves that goal is an arhat. And then the tradition for the goal for the Mahayana is enlightenment, and someone who achieves enlightenment is a Buddha. Okay, so let me look at you. Wow, we're almost at 200. How exciting. Okay, so I'm just so happy you're all here. This is so fun. Okay, so we're talking about the difference between nirvana and enlightenment. So if you have studied a more within the foundation school, if you have studied like Goenkaji's Vipassana or insight meditation, or what are some of the other types of Theravada traditions that we have? Any Thai forest tradition, yeah, the Burmese tradition. Their view of what happened to a Buddha is a little different from what happened to Buddha according to the Mahayana tradition. So within this foundation vehicle, the view of what happened with the Buddha when he passed away is that he went out of existence. okay? No longer in the universe, no longer in the world, no longer existent. But his teachings continue to benefit sentient beings, okay? Now, within the mind, so what he did was he achieved nirvana, which is a liberation from samsara. So samsara is this, is not a place. Sometimes it sounds like samsara is a place, but what it actually is, it is the experience of ordinary beings who have this ignorance in their minds. So when we have ignorance in our minds, we experience the world in a certain way. Okay, we see it as, like we talked about a lot in the last class, we see it as separate, you know, that our minds don't participate in our reality. And as a result of that, we create a lot of suffering for ourselves. So nirvana is this first step, or liberation from samsara is the first step that we can achieve when we're on the path to, according to the Mahayana, what they call Buddhahood. So according to the Mahayana school, what happened with the Buddha when he passed away was that just his body went, you know, his body died, and it rotted and it returned to its physical form, but actually his mind is still present, okay? So an enlightened being has omniscience, which means they have removed all the obstructions. They call them cognitive obstructions. So these are the blocks to being able to know everything. Okay, so that's what omniscience is. Now, remember we talked in the past class that it is not omnipotence, meaning it is not all powerful. So the Buddha can't do anything that they want to all of us. If they could do anything, if they had all power, then all of us would be enlightened. They would already have removed all of our suffering, because they have infinite compassion and infinite love for us, and they want our suffering to be removed. So when they talk about omniscience, this idea of knowing everything, they also talk about the fact that whenever an object is known, there is also consciousness present there, right? So if a being knows everything, then their minds are also present everywhere. So we talk about omnipresence, which means that for the Mahayana view is that an enlightened being is present everywhere, and they have the wish to benefit us wherever, and every sentient being, whenever we create the causes for them to be able to do that. Okay, so we're in this karmic situation where we have to create the causes and the conditions for the Buddhas to be able to benefit us. So you see that nirvana is liberation from samsara, but it's still stuck in this, it has not quite removed the cognitive obscurations to becoming a fully enlightened Buddha. So then someone who has achieved liberation and arhat but has not become a Buddha yet is still limited in some ways in terms of how they can benefit sentient beings. So that's where this motivation, this bodhicitta motivation of wishing to become enlightened in order to be able to fully benefit all sentient beings as much as possible. Okay, having this, you know, consistent, spontaneous wish to benefit all beings. So this becomes the difference between this foundation vehicle and this Mahayana vehicle. And the goal of full enlightenment for the tantric vehicle is the same. They want to also become enlightened as quickly as possible. Now, one would practice the tantric vehicle because it is considered much quicker, okay, a much faster way to benefit sentient beings. And sentient beings are suffering now. They are having difficulties now. And so the sooner that as many of us and everyone can become enlightened, the sooner that we can have that, the suffering removed for those sentient beings that we care for so deeply. Okay. All right, so let's talk now a little bit more about the spread of Buddhism from India to Tibet. So there were certain kings. There were three actually Dharma kings. And I have this really great story about this one king. And it was in the 11th century. So what these Dharma kings would do is that they would invite scholars from actually one of the bigger monastic universities in India. They would try to convince them to come and come to Tibet and teach and spread Buddhism in Tibet, because the Tibetans and the Tibetan kings were very aware that at the time that they were trying to bring Buddhism to Tibet, their people were pretty unruly, and nowadays it's interesting because the Tibetans consider us, us Westerners, very unruly and very, misfits, and and the Tibetan people have actually, they're very calm and they're very, yeah, it's amazing. They're very wise and they're very, yeah, kind. So it's kind of interesting. But the Tibetans were considered the barbarians at the time. So the story that I was going to tell you was about King Yeshe-U. So he was a king who was trying to, in the 11th century, invite one particular Buddhist scholar from India, and the scholar's name was Atisha. And he wanted Atisha very much to come. Now, Atisha was, an amazing practitioner. He had already traveled and spent like 12 years, I think, in Indonesia, learning about this bodhicitta, practicing bodhicitta, developing his realizations of bodhicitta. And he didn't want to come. And in fact, there was a prediction that if he did go to Tibet, his lifetime would be cut short. So what he was raising lots of gold, because it was, I mean, back in the 11th century, we didn't have airplanes, so we're talking about traveling across the Himalayas, to get from northern India to Tibet. So it was a very difficult journey. And so he was raising money, raising gold, and to bring Atisha to Tibet, and he wanted to, of course, make the journey as comfortable as possible, and so he was raising all this gold. So what happened was there was another king in Tibet who wanted the gold that he was raising. So he kidnapped this king, and he imprisoned him, and he told him that in order to ransom you, I want the equivalent of your weight in gold. And so Yeshio had a son, and his son, of course, wanted his father back. And he said, let me give all this gold that we have raised to this king and get you back. And Yeshio said, no, no, he did not want that. So he became very precious to Buddhism, because he was actually willing to sacrifice his freedom and his life to bring Buddhism to Tibet. And so he said, no, use this gold to bring Atisha to Tibet. So of course, when Atisha heard about this, he said, I have to go, right? It's like this king has given up his freedom. And he actually eventually died in captivity with this other king. And Atisha did eventually bring Buddhism. It was actually the second wave of Buddhism to Tibet. So this just demonstrates the commitment of some of these kings and their belief in Buddhism. And of course, they weren't monks or nuns, right? They had countries, they had riches, they had a spiritual life, but at the same time, they had a worldly, what you would call worldly life at the same time. So we have actually the first spread of Buddhism happened into Tibet, happened around the 8th century, and that was with Padmasambhava and Shantarakshita. So Shantarakshita established the first monastery in Tibet and the first ordained monks in Tibet, but he had some obstacles. He had some difficulties. And he actually went back to India, and he said to the king that you need to bring someone who is more powerful than me in terms of this subduing the obstacles, the obstructing spirits, they called it. So Padmasambhava came to Tibet, and he was very powerful tantric master, and he actually ended up subduing many of what they call obstructing spirits and making them what are called dharma protectors. So he brought he converted them to Buddhism and made them protectors of the dharma. So then we have this first wave of Tibetan Buddhism, and then there was a king, not such a nice king, who tried to stamp out Buddhism in Tibet and almost succeeded. So then you have Atisha, who comes in the 8th century. Is that right? No, 11th century. So we have Padmasambhava, Shantarakshita in the 8th century, and then we have Atisha in the 11th century. And so we have, let's see, let's look at the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So we have the Bön school of Tibetan Buddhism, which was actually the shamanistic Tibet Buddha's shamanistic practice that was the original religion of the Tibetan people before Buddhism came. So it was much more based in an animistic kind of or shamanistic, you know, like animal spirits and spirits in the trees, like this. And it throughout the years actually incorporated Buddhism into its beliefs. So it is now considered one of it's the earliest school of Tibetan Buddhism. And then the Nyingma school was established by Padmasambhava and continued up until the 11th century when Atisha showed up. And then the Kagyu school and the Sakya school actually grew out of Atisha's teachings, as well as the Kagyu school had another lineage that came from India of Naropa, Tilopa, Marpa, and Milarepa. I quoted Milarepa in the last class. So Milarepa is considered one of the main founders of the Kagyu school. But the Kagyu and Sakya school are considered newer schools because they're also combined with this lineage of Atisha. Now, the Geluk school, which is the school in which I am teaching, was actually founded by someone called Lama Tsongkhapa, and he's this statue of the big guy that is behind me in the tall yellow hat. That's Lama Tsongkhapa. And he lived in the late 14th century, early 15th century. So 1356 to 1419, I think. Felipe will put up the right dates for you, but those were when Lama Tsongkhapa lived. And he was actually very, very instrumental in standardizing many of the teachings that were prevalent. He studied with Nyingma masters, Kagyu masters, and Sakya masters, and he revitalized and the institution of monasticism. He made it more, he didn't want it to deteriorate, in the sense that sometimes, because monastics had so much power within Tibet, they could get very distracted by worldly things instead of keeping to the more ordained life, or this idea of giving up the householder's life. And so he was very instrumental in sort of revitalizing, reforming in many ways the monastic code. So you will actually see more monks and nuns who exist within the Gelugpa school. So he was the founder of this Gelugpa school. He also established the Monlam Festival, which happens in the Tibetan New Year every year, and it brings all these monastics together to debate. The different schools, it brings them together to debate. And he also wrote a text called the Lamrim Chenmo. So let's take a look at that. So he was really important to him that the teachings become more, oops, where did it go? Oh, okay. There, okay. So Lamrim Chenmo, he wrote a couple of different Lamrim texts. And Lamrim means path, and Rim means stages. So stages on the path to enlightenment. And there's Lama Tsongkhapa's name if you want to know how to spell it, Lama Tsongkhapa. And he's from the area of Song. That's why he's called Lama Tsongkhapa. Losang Drakpa, you might hear of his ordained name. So, okay, so he wrote these texts, and it very much created a system, a way, a path in which we ordinary beings can practice developing these realizations all the way up to the to full enlightenment. Okay, he also wrote a lot of texts related to Tantra, but here we're talking more about what's called the sutra, or the sutra. So the foundation school and the Mahayana, or the great school. So when we talk about this small capacity, medium capacity, and great capacity, he divided it into these three sort of levels. And when we're talking small capacity, it doesn't mean that someone is born this way and they stay this way all their life, okay? Some of us will, we can study these actually all capacities at the same time. But what we start to recognize is that our goals and our aspirations in our practice become different along our journey, okay? And so someone of small capacity is only looking for a better future life. So they want to be born human again, or they want to be born into a better family, or they want to be born having the resources to be able to practice the Dharma in the future. But they aren't necessarily concerned yet about getting free of this whole cycle. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the different realms that everyone can be born into. But this is the idea of they want a higher rebirth. They don't want to go to hell. They don't want to be born as an animal. They don't want to be born as a ghost, okay? So a better future life. And the main aspiration, or the main way that we're practicing when we're in this capacity, is particularly renunciation, okay, which we talked about at the end of the last class, where we don't want to spend our whole lives only focusing on the happiness and the comfort of this life. Okay, so renunciation is about creating space in our lives in which we also are focusing on developing our minds to get free of to get a better future life, and to eventually get free of the samsaric cycle completely. Now, those of medium capacity have the aspiration of nirvana, or liberation completely from samsara. Okay, and the main focus for them is this emptiness of both self and others. So you see that within the small capacity and the medium capacity, you have this foundational school. And then when you get into the great capacity, you start talking about enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, and this aspect of bodhicitta. Okay, all right. Let me see, what else did I want to talk about today? Okay, So let's talk a little bit more about renunciation, since this is um, the main for, it's like the starting place. And the reason why it's the starting place, especially for those of us who are coming to Buddhism as adults who aren't, weren't raised necessarily in Buddhist families, it's this, we all have been, most of us, I'm assuming, most of us have been brought up with this focus on this life, that we want to, when we're young, we want to establish a career and a relationship, and when we're older, we want to establish a family and some stability in our, financial situation and our home. And then as we get older, we look toward, having a good old age. Okay, so very much focused on this life, which is not to say that these are bad goals, okay, at all. But they are very limited. From a Buddhist point of view, they're very limited because they're only about this life. So, and they're also, in many ways, they're very sense pleasure oriented. They're very much about my comfort and my security based on my external conditions. And so when we're developing renunciation, we contemplate some other realities about the world rather than simply those ones that maybe we've only focused on when we're focusing only on this life. So those other realities we talked about in the last class a little bit, and we're going to go into them a little more tomorrow. But they have to do with the four thoughts that turn the mind. So these four thoughts that turn the mind, so the meaning of this are the contemplations that we engage in order to turn the mind toward the Dharma, in order to create space in our lives in which we're willing to practice developing our minds that may not be, may not have an immediate, sense reinforcement. Okay, they may not necessarily make our material circumstances better, but they actually create more happiness in our minds and decrease our negative emotions, which lead us to doing activities that will create a better future life and eventually liberation. So these four thoughts are a precious human life, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. We already talked about death and impermanence, which is the fact that our situation now is going to end. And it is so precious in order to, it's such an opportunity for us to progress spiritually. And then the suffering of existence, the fact that right now what we consider to be the source of our happiness is actually constantly changing and constantly going away. And that this is actually suffering, that this, and this situation of birth, aging, sickness, and death that we are subject to out of our control, we should actually want to be free from it. We should actually want to try to get free from it. And then this way in which we are stuck in the karmic situations that we have, that we are so limited because of our past actions. We have all this suffering that comes to us through our karma, and we can, to get free from being stuck, in this past karma, then we can start to do some of these meditations and develop these perceptions of reality that will stop us from creating this negative karma that keeps us stuck in this situation. Okay, so these are the four thoughts that turn the mind, and they're within, very much within this foundation vehicle, and lead us to renunciation. So what is renunciation? Renunciation, also known as definite emergence, okay? Emergence, definitely wishing to emerge from the suffering of existence. So this term renunciation is, it's an early translation and it's not very accurate. And one of the reasons why is because when the English, when these texts, these Tibetan texts were first being translated into English, the vocabulary they had was very much a Christian vocabulary and a monastic vocabulary. So they're coming from this point of view of the, you know, the tradition of monks and nuns within the Christian or Catholic tradition is a renunciation, which you have these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay, so this idea that you have to give up all worldly things is more what is the meaning of renunciation within this, you know, Catholic terminology. When in fact, when you come to a Buddhist definition of this same term, you actually, definite emergence becomes more important. So your relationship to things is more about how you view them and not so much about whether you have them or not. So in order to become, you know, a Christian, you know, a Catholic monk or nun, you don't own any possessions. And that isn't necessarily true within Buddhism. It's actually more about not expecting your possessions to give you ultimate happiness, not expecting, you know, grasping after or desiring your possessions to be your sole purpose in life. Definite emergence is this wish to be freed from suffering, knowing that sense pleasures and external comfort are not the source of your happiness, but it's your relationship to them that you're trying to emerge from, not necessarily to get rid of them, to be, you know, yeah. So it's about what, of course, what happens in the mind, and it's not about whether you have things or not. And renunciation becomes about developing this space in our lives to develop this lasting happiness. So it's about, instead of working overtime, you know, to get, you know, 2 cars and, you know, a 5-bedroom house and things like this, it becomes about simplifying life and creating space for meditation, creating space for benefiting others, for developing compassion and loving kindness in your mind, instead of, you know, greed and, you know, miserliness, and those sorts of things that can sometimes come from focusing only on material things. Okay, so I think that's all I want to talk about today. So if you have some questions, we can take questions now.
Okay, so please type your questions in the chat. Okay, so we have a question about karma. I'll mute Shmuel. You can now ask your question.
Oh, I have to turn off my spotlight. Okay.
Hello. So my question goes back a bit. Actually, it's about karma, but I think it's related. So are there any proofs of karma that can be presented at this stage?
Proofs of karma, the logical reasoning. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about material proofs?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So it comes from the logic behind karma.
I'm talking about the logical reasoning that prove karma, especially the idea, the part of karma that the thing that.
Oh, you got muted there. Got to unmute again.
Yeah, and also your microphone is very, very faint. If you could turn up the volume of your microphone, would be good.
It's better now?
Yes.
Better, yes.
So I'm talking about the logical proofs for karma, if there are, especially for the idea that what happens to us is the result of actions we did in the past. So for example, if somebody is rich, it is the result of generosity, maybe in a past life. So are there proofs for that?
So the logical proof, my understanding is that is this concept of interdependence. And the fact that we, our minds participate, that consciousness is present within any action and affects reality. So that means that our intention has an effect in the world. And so if we intend to be generous, then this effect of this, the result of intending to be generous is that others intend generosity toward us. And the reason underlying that is this idea of that a cause will create an effect that is similar, in the sense that, you know, like we talked about, positive intentions result in positive experiences. So we're talking about cause and effect. We use it on a physical basis of like the strawberry seed that causes the strawberry plant. So you can have a watermelon seed causing a strawberry plant. So that's the basis of this like produces like. Now, how the seeds are carried in the mind stream that then influence our experiences and result in our experiences, this I have not seen proof of, because we cannot see it. We can only look at physical proof, you know, of cause and effect, and apply that to the mind and say that this same effect that happens on a physical level also happens on a mental level. Because why would it be different? The mind is also subject to cause and effect. So why wouldn't those positive or negative intentions that we have that are then expressed in actions also not have an effect in the same way? Now, we can't actually see those effects because of the complexity. So the complexity of interdependence, and the fact that any one experience of any situation comes together with many causes and conditions, including the seeds that we've planted in our mind stream. So the ability to see all those different factors that go into any one experience is only the realm of a Buddha who has omniscience, not in the realm of any ordinary being.
Okay, thank you. I'll think of it.
Okay, great. You're welcome.
But you know, actually, I want to ask if so. So how, since the belief in karma is the first stage of the person that wants a higher rebirth, so how can we generate a strong enough belief in that, if that's the very first stage that all the others have to be before it?
Yeah. Well, one thing they talk about is when you can't know something directly, you can you only know it through an authority. So for example, the Buddha taught it. So you would have to have faith that what the Buddha taught is actually true. So you develop a faith, say, in those other teachings. So there are other teachings that the Buddha taught that are more obvious, okay, that you can understand. So then you become more trusting in the Buddha as a teacher, and then you trust whatever he taught in terms of karma. And you develop faith that way, even though you can't know it directly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, welcome. Next question.
Okay, I'll move on to Polly. Polly, question?
Oh, hello. I was just wondering if you have any recommendations for Lamrim texts for beginners and or Westerners.
Well, There's a really good shortened one that's like called Lamrim Outlines. It's by one of the nuns who's at Kopan Monastery. Lamrim Outlines. There's so that's on the more simple. Now the more advanced Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo has been translated into English. And what's in the middle? You know, How to Practice is a really good one by His Holiness. Maybe Felipe has some ideas. Felipe?
Not really.
No,
What you
Lamrim
said,
text. Yes, Lamrim. I mean, there's commentary on. They're usually because it's so extensive. They usually only teach on specific parts of it. To get the whole thing, it's kind of hard. Oh well, you know, actually, the Geshe Sopa, S-O-P-A, Stages on the Path to Enlightenment. And it was a teaching over many years that he taught. And I think it's translated and it's in 5 volumes. So there's, and also this is for the previous Shmuel, I think. There's a volume 2 is on karma. So volume 1 is on the foundation, volume 2 is on karma, and then they have one on emptiness, they have one on bodhicitta, and I don't remember what the other one is. But that's a good one too. Much more, I think, accessible than even Lama Tsongkhapa's.
It's called Steps to the Path of Enlightenment.
Yeah, Steps to the Path of Enlightenment.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sure, you're welcome.
Now I'm muting Annalise. You can now ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for these beautiful teachings. I really appreciate it. I have a simple question to ask. Is it correct to say that the small and the medium capacity refers to Theravada and the great capacity to Mahayana and Vajrayana?
Mostly, yes. The great capacity is Mahayana. It doesn't include Tantra at this point.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and the small and medium scope is mostly Theravada, but the emptiness part is a little different. So the wisdom within the Lamrim is includes the emptiness of phenomena as well as the emptiness of self, and you won't find that within the Theravada schools.
Okay.
You'll only find selflessness. Sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now moving on to Vidi. Vidi, you can now ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for yet another beautiful class from your side, and thanks to Tishita as well. So my question is, these 4 schools or the monastics that you referred to, Kagyu, Sakya, and others, do they all have same teachings or is it somehow different?
They emphasize different aspects. So within the school that I'm teaching, the intellectual aspect is, and this idea of moving from the conceptual to the more experiential is emphasized. Whereas in the say the Kagyu or the Nyingma tradition, you talk more about starting with meditation as being your emphasis, and then the teachings come in a different way there. So the teachings they don't contradict, but they emphasize different aspects.
Okay, but the basics, they remain the same.
Yes, yes, those 4 thoughts that turn the mind are existent in all 4 schools. I think all 5 schools. Yeah, it's more, I think, emphasis on like the techniques. They all have the same view of emptiness. Yeah, they all have highest yoga tantra. Yeah, that's right. They all have highest yoga tantra in them as well.
And the three vehicles you explained, they have different goals, but what they tell you about Buddhism, would it remain the same, or is it also?
No, no. The three vehicles, in particular, the Theravada vehicle has more philosophical differences than the Mahayana and the Tantra. The Mahayana and the Tantra are the same, but the Theravada would have different ones. Yeah, different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for answering the question. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, now moving on to Solial.
Okay, last one, and then we'll meditate.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this class. I would like to, I'm not sure I really understood well the difference between nirvana and enlightenment.
Okay.
Is nirvana a step before enlightenment? I mean, in Mayavana? Or is it, or it doesn't exist nirvana in Mahayana and it is only enlightenment?
Right. So within the Mahayana tradition, you do have liberation as a step to enlightenment. So liberation from samsara is the first thing, you know, that we achieve. And then we go on and we continue as bodhisattvas until we achieve full enlightenment.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank
so
you.
It's, yeah, sure. Definitely present.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Should we do some meditation now?
Yes.
Okay. So everyone, please go back to your posture, setting up your comfortable position, trying to get your body, especially to be nice and relaxed. And allowing the bell to bring you first into the space of the body. Taking a moment to settle down, to relax, to let go of any tension that might still be present in the body. Allowing the awareness to become grounded, stable. Taking a moment to just observe what happens in the space of physical sensations. Just being present with the body as it is, while at the same time releasing all tension. Settle down and relax. And gently letting go of observing the body and physical sensations. Moving to the space of the mind. So first we start by analyzing how in our lives we chase after so many things. So many stimuli that bring sensory pleasure. But how many of these things have really provided us with lasting and unchanging happiness? As children, we took refuge in our mother and father or caregiver. Maybe you can even remember an instance where as a child you fell down and got hurt. And at that moment when you're experiencing suffering, we turn to our parents or caregivers. We know already at this age that this is refuge. By the time we are teenagers, we rebel against our parents and we seek help from our friends, feeling that they are the only people who really understand us when we go through difficulties, when we are upset. We turn to them seeking their advice and their support. And sometimes we take refuge in food. It so happens that we often feel a little bit stressed or feel sad. And we get the sense that eating is the only way to forget about these problems. We may start overeating, especially comfort food like chocolate, ice cream, cheesecake, French fries. And then we have a sense that these things will relieve the pain and that they can give us lasting happiness. But is that really the case? Others may take refuge in a healthy diet. We might become completely obsessed with what we eat, making sure that we have the best ingredients sourced from the most exotic places. Everything needs to be organic, hand-picked, coming from a specific area of Ethiopia or Brazil, harvested at the end of the lunar calendar. And we think that maintaining this healthy diet will be the sole cause for our happiness. But is that really so? We also take refuge in relationships, believing this person will make me happy. We develop attachment, and in turn, we suffer from these encounters. Sometimes we have a feeling that if only we were able to get together with that person, then all the trouble in our lives will disappear. Yet the suffering remains. We might find comfort in music when we feel sad and blue. We might find that listening to sad music may relieve us. Sometimes the lyrics, the words help us to express our sadness. When we feel lonely, we may find comfort in knowing that somebody else is sharing on our state of mind, that they also went through the same things, which brings a sense of release and relief, feeling identified. As young adults, we might take refuge in our studies, in school or university. Have you ever defined yourself or evaluated your worth in terms of your grades? Did you spend days and sleepless nights in the library trying to pass that exam, thinking that that would be the source of your happiness? And sometimes we find refuge in intoxicants such as drugs or alcohol, trying to ignore and not to deal with the difficulties in our lives. Sometimes we try to drown our problems or to soothe the pain by smoking it away. And later in life, if you experience a midlife crisis or upon reaching adulthood, we may take refuge in our careers, thinking, this is what brings purpose to my life. And so we take refuge in our work by becoming a workaholic. Sometimes we even try to ignore or not to face our problems by working compulsively, being the first person to arrive in the office and the last to leave. Using it as a way to deal with the sufferings in our lives. So stop for a moment and ask yourself, all this time, all these things, how many of them actually brought you true, unchanging, genuine happiness? How long did the pleasure that you got out of these things actually last? Consider food, healthy diet, relationships, past friends, intoxicants, music, studies, or job. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, how much happiness has your life gained from all these things? These are all ways that we use to end our suffering, but those are only temporary. We've tried all these things again and again, and still we seem to encounter suffering. We are still not free. Again and again, we run into problems and difficulties, reacting to them negatively. We continue to create the causes for suffering in the future. But we don't want to suffer anymore. We've had enough. And the true meaning of renunciation has to do with giving up the suffering, wishing to stop it and to cut the causes that bring us the suffering. It has a sense of letting go of what is not useful for us. So if you want to develop a kind, peaceful, and happy mind, the only way to do so is to stop looking outside of ourselves and to turn our attention inwards. A lasting and reliable refuge can only be something that comes from within. It is within that we find the deeper meaning of renunciation. a mental attitude, which has nothing to do with things outside. So the only thing that can protect us from suffering, the source of our everlasting, unchanging happiness, lies within our own mind, within our own heart. Following the inner path, following the advice of developing our inner qualities, qualities of wisdom, loving kindness, and compassion, we will achieve genuine happiness by turning inward. So take a moment to imagine the deepest dimension of your own life in the form of a small radiating sphere of light at the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. This ball of light represents your inner wisdom, your universal goodness, the source of your present and future happiness. Cultivating the mind of renunciation, giving rise to the thought to be free of suffering, giving up its causes, but not only for ourselves, also for others. Imagine radiating from the center of your heart immeasurable rays of light out to the universe, with the wish that everyone, loved ones, family members, friends, whoever you may meet in your life, and all other beings, be truly well and happy and free of all their suffering. Slowly and gently coming out of the meditation, taking a moment to become aware once again of your surroundings, of your body. And as we usually do, taking a moment to offer and dedicate any positive potential, any virtuous action, any merit that we've created in the session by reading from Shantideva's dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and find repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be free from their ailments. Whatever diseases are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and may those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefit in each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the mysteries of the world.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and
Oops.
please come
Sorry.
tomorrow. That's okay. I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you for coming.
And just because a few people were asking, just so you all know, those of you who are new, we are recording the sessions and we are posting them, the links to them on our Facebook page. So if you previously had a Google Drive link, we're not doing that anymore. We're posting them on our Facebook page. So check our Facebook page. I will leave the link now for you all and wait a minute before I close the session so that you can get the previous videos and the videos from these sessions and the following ones. And please give us some time to upload them because we have to process them and upload them as well. So yeah, there's the link. Thank you all for coming and see you all tomorrow. Bye.